Hello, I'm Bruce at The Risky Scientists, and I'm delighted to be speaking with Professor Mike McCulloch of Plymouth University. Welcome back, Mike.
Hello, thank you.
So Mike, we're going to talk about a very serious issue, which is your experience in academia and the wider questions about academic freedom and free speech in these strange times in 2020. So can you just introduce yourself briefly to the audience, people who may not know you?
Okay, well, I'm as you said, a university lecturer at the University of Plymouth, a lecturer in geomatics, which is the mathematics of positioning in space. And most of my publications are in physics. And before that, I was working at the Met Office before 2008. Since then, I've been a lecturer.
Thank you, Mike. So we've got I like happy discussions, but this is we've got a narrative here. So you've had the positive part of this story is the ending. So there's a sort of a happy ending. You can. I speak for myself. I'm glad that it ended better than other academics have experienced similar circumstances. People I know. So there's a happy ending. You saved your job, but I'm going to preface this by saying we're going to talk about how your job was under threat. Your job as an academic was under threat. So can you give us the background to this story? How did this story start?
So I suppose the first time I knew something was up was last October, when I received an email from my head of school saying that a complaint had been received about my Twitter feed. So I met with her and one other senior colleague, and it was agreed that I should put on my Twitter header, these are my opinions and not those of my employer, and also erase any reference to Plymouth. So I did that. And then in January of this year, I was due a bit later to give a talk at Leeds University, but in January I got an email from the organizer to say that she'd seen my Twitter feed and some of my tweets seemed rude. So they were no longer comfortable about hosting me at Leeds University to give a talk on physics. So my talk was cancelled, but then I appealed to the Vice Chancellor of Leeds University and the head of the School of Physics and Astronomy there, and said that this amounted to, I said in my email, that this amounted to intellectual bullying, in my opinion. It should be possible to express ideas in physics without people questioning my political beliefs or opinions. So they reinstated my talk, and I gave my talk quite recently, actually, on Zoom to the physics department there. But then more recently, and this was on the 6th of June, I received another email from my head of school, a very, very polite one. She's been very polite throughout this, saying that a complaint had been received, an anonymous complaint about my Twitter feed, another one. And this time they had listed all the tweets I'd liked over a 24-hour period and sent them to the equalities team at the university. And that, well, some of the tweets that I'd liked, one of them said, "All lives matter." I'd liked that. One of them said that gender has a scientific basis, and I'd liked that. And one of them complained about mass immigration, and I'd liked that. And the complainant had used this to infer that I was an extremist. They claimed I was black-hating, woman-hating, immigrant-hating, which is not true. I think my ideas my opinions are quite reasonable in this respect, and possibly quite common.
Majoritarian, in fact, yeah.
Yes, and I think they're mine to have. It's supposed to be a free society. So she asked me what I said to this, and I responded saying something like that these were simply my opinions, and I think they are reasonable. And then about a week later, I got another email to say that a follow-up complaint had been received and my Twitter behavior had not changed, and that I was now under investigation by by the university for my Twitter likes. So a senior colleague was appointed to be the investigator, and there was going to be a meeting, sort of a panel discussion on the 1st of July. And this is a first step. The next step, after the investigation, they decided whether to escalate this to a disciplinary hearing, which would be a more serious affair and could lead to my dismissal. So obviously I was quite upset by this. I could see my career ebbing away. So I mentioned it on Twitter, actually. I just mentioned on Twitter that I was being investigated by my university for my Twitter likes, and I got an awful lot of support from there. And several kind lawyers contacted me, some of whom have been following me on Twitter, and offered help and advice. And I suppose the most useful advice they gave me was that there was such a thing as the Human Rights Act in 1998, which states that universities must be seen to protect the freedom of speech of their staff and students. Otherwise, they can be taken to court. So after talking to the lawyers, and also, and some of them, I should say, came from Toby Young's free speech group. I realised
that group myself.
Right. Yeah, I think it's growing rapidly at the moment. Yeah, so I felt much better after that, and Toby Young's group and others offered legal representation for this meeting, and even some funds if they were needed in the future. And they and I emailed the university to say that I now had legal representation, and the next day they dropped the investigation completely, so I didn't need to go to the panel, which was a great relief, because one of the lawyers said to me that it's quite likely that at the panel they would have asked me whether I would be willing not to talk about politics and opinion on Twitter, and I was quite keen to say no, and I was quite concerned that this would have led to an escalation. So the upshot is that I'm no longer under investigation.
Right, so this is a complex story. It involves two universities. It involves various ladders of investigation and threat of investigation. But it's not an untypical story, and I think actually it's, I'll just add a caveat. I think this is much more frequent than we realize, because the people involved don't publicize what's going on. So let me just, because it's a complex story, I'll ask you some questions to clarify how your assessment, your estimates, in a sense, of the, let's say the probabilities of where this could have gone. So let's, at the end of your story, the investigation is dropped by your university just after it's the day after you email you've got legal advice. Yeah. So do you estimate that your email about your legal advice was necessary and or sufficient for the investigation to be dropped?
Yes, I think it was a major factor in it. I should say there was pressure from another source as well that I can't talk about, but I think the email was important.
So probably we could say both of these sources were necessary, and perhaps one or the other was sufficient, but at least both were necessary. Is that what you're saying?
Mm.
Right, so thank you. So let's clarify the other thing. So two universities were involved. So before your own university, so I'm meaning your employer, made an issue of your Twitter feed, a or actually, I may have got this wrong. So an external university, Leeds, made an issue of your Twitter
Yes.
feed. That's sort of in between your own employer's first discussion with you about it, and then this more recent discussion. Is that right?
That's right. So Leeds mentioned something in January.
Yeah. So can you estimate whether the two universities' actions are connected? So
Well,
is it possible that the same complainant is activating both of those universities?
no, because I know that the second complainant was actually more local.
Right. So okay. So different complainants, but somewhat coincident in a time scale of months.
Yes, that's right. I'm sorry to be hesitant, but some of these things, when you say them, you have to work out whether it's wise to say them.
Yeah.
Um,
And estimates are difficult, and particularly in the new norm of academic investigations. I speak from the hearsay I hear from my circle, my academic circle. Often academics are accused, and they're not allowed to know. They're not even allowed to know what they're accused of. So they said, you've tweeted something, but we're not going to tell you what the specific complaint is. And then you get and then other academics, they get accused of things, and they may be told what it is, but they're not allowed to defend themselves. So the investigation is one-sided. That is increasingly common in academia too.
well, in my case, it was an anonymous complaint. At least I saw what the complaint was in the second time. But I was told I was not allowed to present in public what the complaint was. So it becomes rather like Kafka, doesn't it? That you have an anonymous complaint that you're not allowed to reveal to others.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's get some of these parameters, some other parameters set here before we discuss the wider implications of this. So one of the terms you use, and I've seen you've written this term "rude" in quotes. So when Leeds, you got a complaint from Leeds. So you were you were accused, or your tweets, to be more exact, your tweets were accused of being rude. Right?
Yeah.
Like, rude is a very unacademic term. So do you have any estimate of what this actually meant in this context?
Well, in the case of Leeds, it could be one of two things, and I'm afraid I don't know which one of the two things it is. But when I talk about physics and specifically dark matter on Twitter, I can be quite. I suppose people who study dark matter would find it insulting, the way I present it, because I'm making it out to be a worthless endeavor sometimes.
Yeah.
So it could be that aspect of it, or it could simply be that some of my political opinions I do tend to present that way as well.
So is it correct that you actually don't know specifically what the term rude was being applied to?
That's right, yes. I mean, on Twitter, I do try and be as polite as I possibly can, but when it comes to dark matter, I do sometimes use language that could be seen as insulting to those who are studying it.
Right. So maybe I can ask you give an example of that, because I subscribe to your Twitter feed, and I cannot recall something that I think is rude. So, but you think something might be interpreted as rude. So can you give me an example of what you think might be considered rude about dark matter?
Well, I suppose I think one time I commented on some talks that were being given in the physics department, and it was almost like a word salad. the language used in the title of the talk was extremely complicated, and so I think I said something like it was a meaningless word salad.
So meaningless. That's so you're quoting yourself. The word was meaningless.
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Or perhaps worse. Okay, right. So I mean, I think there's a wider issue here we can explore here. Is that I find the people taking issue with the words we use is an inherently unscientific, unless you're going to take an issue with definition or meaning. So the concept itself or the definition, that's how you would take issue with words. And then the other thing I think is unscientific is if you're challenging science, as scientists, aren't we supposed to be challenging other people's science? So
yes, we are. Otherwise, we might just as well keep the old textbooks, and we don't need academics.
Yeah. So I'm not. Can we be scientists if we can't say to other scientists, I think your theory is wrong, or your concept is wrong, or your definition is wrong, or your data are wrong?
Well, I think that would be excruciating, actually.
Are we in that position? Do you think we're in that position where now we struggle to tell other scientists?
It seems that we're in that position, yes. But I don't think that science can progress that way. I think science should be a rigorous back and forth. And we should have the sort of skeptical attitude that we question each other all the time. And if we're not allowed to do that for politeness or the risk of offending, then it does start to affect the way we think, not just the way we talk. It then impacts the way we think.
Yeah.
And I think that is profoundly unhealthy, because it affects what happens when we're thinking about science as well.
Yeah. So I think there's another threat to science that emerges from your story, and that is what I think of as the conflation of your scientific tweeting or your position as a scientist. So you're employed in a particular discipline, and you were going to speak to another university in that discipline, and yet the issue was taken with the manner in which you communicated science, but also with your unrelated opinions on things like immigration and gender.
Well, possibly, yes.
Well, okay, so yes, we're assuming. So what's going on here? That how widespread do you think the problem is? Because I don't want to speak too much about how I perceive it. So, do you feel as a scientist? Do you feel as a scientist that if you're employed as an academic, are we allowed to have public opinions outside of our discipline?
Well, I would have to say yes, because I would say being a scientist is not just, you don't just apply it to science. Science teaches you a kind of attitude where you're supposed to make decisions based on facts with reason applied.
And to clarify, you're talking prescriptively here, not descriptively. So you're talking about how we should be allowed to have opinions as a scientist.
That's right, because I think you can apply science to everything.
Yeah.
This is one of the ideas of the Enlightenment, that whenever you make a decision, you look at the facts and you use reason and you leave emotion out of it. I suppose a stereotypical example of that in Star Trek is Mr. Spock, isn't it? That was sort of an example of that kind of thinking. And I think we've progressed a long way not just in science, but also in society because of that sort of thinking.
Yeah. So you spoke prescriptively there. So let me ask the question descriptively. Do you think that whether or not we should be able to apply our science outside of our discipline, do you think normatively now academics do or have the freedom? Do they feel they have the freedom to apply their science outside of their discipline?
No, I'd say definitely not.
Yeah.
I've spoken to quite a lot of people, and it seems that the very people in our society who are supposed to provide wisdom and guidance, in other words, academics, no matter what their situation, have effectively been silenced because of a sort of rising tide of the importance of emotion.
Yes.
Some sort of hysteria that has come upon us. So, yeah. So people who are supposed to be producing reason and fact and wisdom are simply too scared to speak.
Yeah, so I'm going to agree with you. So I'm on record as agreeing with you. So I think this is a normative problem, and I can observe generally that academics and now even hard scientists like your good self are feeling the pressure on their free speech to apply, in fact, not just their science outside of their discipline, but even within their discipline. So we're seeing now that hard scientists, for me as a social scientist, I've seen social science collapse into social studies and the science has dropped out. And there are a few of us trying to do science, and I've seen there are still a lot of good scientists, not a majority, but there's still a lot of good scientists in social science trying to hold on to the science. But even there are scientists, they bifurcate their lives, so they have their true science in their social science, but they still talk the talk they need to keep their jobs or get promoted in academia. So there's that silence is compliance thing, or there's the active promotion of the agenda in order to get ahead in academia, even if you are a scientist. But as a social scientist, I always looked at disciplines like yours and said, well, at least maths and physics, they can't put agendas there, but they are. So it's not just your case, but other cases. So why is that? Why are the hard sciences following the way of the social sciences?
Well, that's a very big question. I'm not a social scientist, but I could. It's very interesting that I could see it coming also in my in physics, because when I've been challenging dark matter for 13 years now, and at first it was fine. People were willing to invite me to conferences because they really didn't know how dangerous to them what I was suggesting was. As soon as they realized in 2012, I was unable to attend conferences, and I was censored on the archive, which is a physics treatment archive. But it's very interesting that there is sort of a spreading of hysteria, and in order to try and understand this, I've been reading a book by Strauss and Howe. I don't know if you've heard about this one, the Fourth Turning. So the idea there is that every 80 years there's an 80-year cycle in society where you have an extreme war, such as the one from 1940, 1945, which encourages people to think in this way, sort of using facts and reason to make wise decisions. And then 80 years later, all the people who've been trained to do this die off. And so the people left are left floundering about with emotion until the chaos causes another war, and we all learn how to do it again. And I read this book, and I'm quite impressed by this thesis.
Yeah, so that actually parallels that thesis, or let's say it's a theory. It parallels some theories of war themselves in international relations, which is one of my specialties. So one theory is that big wars particularly, they long cycle. So the lessons from the war you've just gone through are very pacifying, because you've learned the ideologies to avoid, and you've learned the mechanisms to favor in making peace. But then those lessons die off, and sometimes they literally die off with the generation that had experienced that war. But then other things become priorities, and there's issue linkage and other political mechanisms that we can imagine partaking in this general trend back to cycle back to ideologies and inferior ways of doing things. Now, so the theory you're talking about is it's familiar to me through my own discipline. Now, one implication of that theory is, if we're in an 80-year cycle, I mean, the 30s, 40s were bad years for lots of reasons. One of them, we had war, which is a terrible issue in itself, and I specialize in that. But also we had some very difficult ideologies. So one implication of this 80-year cycle is those ideologies come back. So let me put the question to you. What are the parallels that you see in the ideas, the ideational part of the time we're living in, 2020, and 80 years ago?
Well, yes, so what we're seeing now, and I don't want to be seen as being too extreme in this, but I can't help but mention it because I've noticed it. All this talk about STEM being racist reminds me very much of the German Aryan science of the 1930s.
Yeah.
So I think we're in something like the 1930s now. So there was a chaotic period in Germany, the Weimar Republic, where there was a lot of chaos, and on the streets, I think the left were fighting with the right an awful lot, until eventually the German society chose the right and went fully in that direction. And it seems to be very similar now, except the society may have chosen to go left instead. Well, I'm not quite sure.
Some societies did, right? So yes,
true, yes.
Some went very communist, some went very fascist / Nazi, whatever that the true characterization of that right end of the spectrum was. And there were a lot of people in Britain, say at British universities, as it happened, like the Cambridge Five, who ended up spying for the Soviet Union against the British government, within the British government. Their attitude, their rationalization of what they did was, there were only two sides you could pick. One was fascist, and if you didn't want to be fascist, you had to be communist. And just a note aside, that's a false choice, because there are other choices. You can choose democracy, for instance, classical liberal democracy.
Another time that's similar to this appears to be the McCarthyite.
Yeah.
McCarthyism in the 50s. I watched a film recently about Dalton Trumbo. So that's quite an interesting one as well. Yeah.
So let's unpack some implications for science here. So if you're experiencing physics, what I think we all experience in social science, which is it's effectively a constraint on free speech, and there are material punishments and material rewards if you do not comply with the fashionable agenda of our time. Now, I'm on record as being very pessimistic about where this will go. So I'm just speaking for myself. I don't want to prejudice your answer to this. How bad can this get before we cycle back to reason?
Well, it's a very interesting time, because although it seems a very loud minority is going left, democracy is actually trying to drag us to the right simultaneously. because in Britain, people are voting for the Tories, in America, obviously for Trump, in Brazil, for Bolsonaro. So it's almost as if, well, it's rather, as I said, like Weimar Germany, these two opposing sides, and I'm not sure which one is going to win.
Yeah.
And I must say, I do not know particularly which side I want to win, because, well, they both seem to be bad choices, as you said.
Yeah. Particularly when we live in a two-party system. So I'll speak as my American side. In a two-party system, when both parties are giving you bad choices, you only have a bad outcome. I mean, and then the people get blamed. The people get blamed for making choices, but their choices are constrained by the parties that organize the options, and then you can't really blame the people for the ultimate outcome, because there's a whole process of choices that are being made before the people actually get their active part in the process, which is the general election. So I like your comparison of Weimar Germany and then the process to Nazism, because it's almost like in political science we talk about that as the tyranny of the minority. So John Stuart Mill talked about the main problem with democracy is the tyranny of the majority, and he just meant that if we choose to live under majority rule, the minority is going to be disappointed. So somebody has to win, right? So Trump wins, the anti-Trump side are going to be disappointed. So every time we have a democratic election, it doesn't matter if it's free and fair. Sorry, it does matter prescriptively that it's free and fair. But for the point I'm making, irrespective of whether it's free and fair, somebody's going to be disappointed, even if it's free and fair. So that's the tyranny of the majority. But it seems to me we're living in the tyranny of the minority. So the minority who dominates academic decisions at the highest level, and also the news media and particularly the tech companies who own our social media. It seems to me like a tyranny of the majority, and it's a tyranny of the minority, and it's not a scientific minority.
And I wonder if this is because our society has moved on from, I don't know, book learning, you could say. The media is so powerful now that a few extremely passionate people, loud people, can dominate the entire society by using television. And that may be one possible reason for this. And I should say that I used to be on the left until recently, and now I have far more sympathy, I must say, for the right. I find myself agreeing with Trump far more than I do with the left. So I have to make that clear, and I've made a shift in the past year.
Do you think that this issue? So let me ask you: are you implying that there is a right-left split on science?
No, I'm speaking. What I'd like to be protected is freedom of speech, and I am against mass immigration because I think it's a destabilizing process, and so I am now in more sympathy with the right, even though economically I am on the left because I believe in a welfare state and things like that. So I'm a bit of a mix, but at the moment I'm shifting to the right.
Yeah, so well, that's your personal politics, and I think your personal politics illustrate a general problem with these characterizations of right and left, that all of us as individuals don't perfectly fit that spectrum, and even
sort of one-dimensional thing.
Yeah, right. So we can have views that would be characterized as left-wing by the simplistic political scientist on this issue, and then we could be characterized as right-wing on this other issue as individuals. And in fact, even democracies are difficult. The general electorate is difficult to place on the right-left spectrum, and that's particularly true in British politics.
Yes, but the trouble is our democratic system is based on this one-dimensional model.
Yeah. Well, do you think that's really true? Because, I mean, take the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party shifted dramatically left under David Cameron and Theresa May, and they justified that as just, you know, they're chasing the voter, and you know, if the centre shifts, you have to go with it. I think they actually went beyond the centre, and it didn't work well for them. So then Boris Johnson comes in. The Conservative Party, though, is, you know, so we saw data recently that the Conservative Party is attracting lower income voters than the Labour Party. It's Labour Party, actually, the median voter is actually of a higher wealth. So it's completely reversed the traditional party politics, which Labour was established for the working class or the labouring class, right? And the Conservatives were...
I think that's because immigration damages the economics of the lower classes more than it does the middle class, doesn't it?
Right. So do you think, just stick with British politics, because you and I both know it well. Do you think that the traditional political polls even apply to current party politics? I mean, should we be talking about Brexit positions and socioeconomic positions and immigration positions, and just get away from talking about left and right? Because when we do that, we're just going to be reductionist.
Well, in my opinion, we should be going to a Swiss system where we have referendum on particular cases. And I think that would be the way to fix the problem.
Right.
So you ask people, do you want immigration? And they say yes or no.
Right. I admire you, Mike. You have thought about this a lot. That you are much more thoughtful and also applied than most people in my own discipline, if I can be frank. Because I think part of the consensus, the fashionable consensus, is you don't go there. You don't explore these alternative options. You just say populism has won the election. Populism is wrong. Populists mislead the electorate. The majority were uneducated and ignorant. They were misled, and the system's fine. It's just the people are wrong, and then you can never explore alternatives if you're going to be in that position.
Well, I think we should have more confidence in people's ability to choose what they want, and I think if we do that, that will improve things anyway. Because say if you give people a choice, they will suddenly start studying: should we have immigration? Should we not? What are the consequences of it? And they will become more enlightened. And I think this will lift the whole society.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm on record as being very critical of concepts like populism. So populism is a concept that literally means anti-elitism. And in fact, most of us, when we're asked survey questions along those lines, are anti-elitist. And in fact, the left is traditionally the most anti-elitist part of the spectrum. And yet, populism is used to describe anything popular that you don't like. So if somebody gets elected in a general election and you don't like that person, you say that's populism succeeding. And
yes, I've noticed that. Yes, from popular to populist.
Yeah.